Hello and welcome to this discussion about White Moss, or what has become White Moss, this beautiful book, a novel by Anna Nerkagi, soon to be published by Pushkin Press. I think this possibly airs on publication day even. It was translated by Irina Sadovina. My name is Rebecca DeWald, and I'm the Emerging Translator Mentorships Program Manager at the National Centre for Writing. And I first came across White Moss when Irina applied for one of our mentorships back in 2021 and was awarded the mentorship to work with mentor Oliver Reddy, who's also joining us today, on precisely this book. So the story of its translation goes back at least 5 years, though given that the book itself was written in the 90s, the story itself probably precedes that much longer. And that's what we're here to discuss today. We're going to attempt to recharge its journey from text, from the translator coming across the book, to then becoming a mentorship project and becoming edited, being picked up by a publisher, becoming edited, and becoming a published book in the end. And just to get you to give you an idea of like the journey a translation can take from original idea to finished book. To introduce you, who I've got with me today is we've got Irina Sadovina, who translates from Russian in Mari, and her translations and writing have appeared in publications including Prototype, Meniscus, the Calvert Journal, and Ellipse. As I said, she was our 2021-22 mentee, and she also received the 2021 Australasian Association of Writing Programs Translational Prize, also for example of White Moss. So it's a very highly awarded novel already. She's also a university teacher of Russian at the School of Languages, Arts and Societies at the University of Sheffield. And as I mentioned, Irina did a mentorship with Oliver Reddy, who is a literary translator and scholar and teaches at St. Edmund Hall in Oxford. His translations include Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, Gogol's Essential Stories, and 4 novels by Vladimir Sharov. He has received 3 prizes for his translations of recent Russian fiction and was shortlisted for the PEN Translation Prize for Crime and Punishment. And he has recently completed a biographical study of Nikolai Gogol. And this is about the translation, but obviously the translation has now become a finished book, and it wouldn't have become a finished book if it hadn't been for Rory Williamson, who's also joining us here, the editor at Pushkin Press. Rory was born in Glasgow and studied literature in Cambridge and Montreal. Before starting publishing, he proofread a lot of academic essays and made a few decent flat whites, apparently. He's drawn to surprising and unusual books and likes to read widely across different cultures and translation. And I should also mention Rory is currently shortlisted for the TA First Translation Prize for co-editing with John Siciliano, Gwendolyn Harper's translation from Spanish of A Last Supper of Queer Apostles by Pedro Lemuel. So congratulations for that. I think by the time this airs, we don't quite know yet whether you will have won it, but we're keeping our fingers crossed in any case. So to talk about the book, I think I want to hand over to Irina first of all, because you drew us into all of this. So can you tell us about Anna Nerkagi? How did you first hear about the book? What is the book? And what made you want to translate it?
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. Well, it is quite a story. I was living in North America at the time, and I was still trying to make it in academia. So I was kind of doing short-term projects, gigs here and there, and I was getting really frustrated with it. And I think it was not very happy with me, or at least I could not convince anybody that what I'm putting down is worth picking up. But equally, I was finding that the kind of writing, the kind of cross-cultural thinking that I really want to do is just not possible in that industry for whatever reason. It wasn't at the time, and I don't think it is now, at least not for me. And my last big attempt at making academia work was a project that was about Indigenous cultures, or rather a culture about my own. I was really interested in how the Mari, which is an ethnic group that I come from, are or were historically perceived by outsiders, and the sort of possibilities and impossibilities and paradoxes and frustrations of that kind of cross-cultural communication. So in my attempt at performing that cross-cultural communication, I just realized that it's not happening. I'm just not interested anymore in this question of how small groups are perceived by larger majority cultures. Ironic, because of course, I almost immediately ended up reading this book. And reading this book also happened to me in a really dramatic way. It's not like I was just in the library, or somebody recommended it. I had a short-term teaching gig in Siberia, which is for me quite exotic. I've never been. And I went there for 2 months. And on my first day there, somebody just gave me this book. And they were like, "This is the most important author of our region. You have to read this." I started reading it. I read it all through the night. I sobbed through the night because it was so good. And I felt so grateful and just blown away and amazed by the subtleties of the way that the author described the positions of different people within this small indigenous community. And that's how I decided that I really have to translate it, no matter what my skepticism has been up until now about doing these kinds of cross-cultural translations. I just knew that this book will speak to somebody, hopefully to a lot of people. And the people that I had in mind immediately were some friends from Toronto who come from First Nations communities. And I just really wanted them to read it. So that is the story of how I found this book. And then I immediately basically decided to quit academia, translate this book instead. And this teaching job came up in the UK, which is what I'm doing now. I work for the University of Sheffield at a language center, and I took that job. And I thought, okay, I'm gonna do this translation.
Wow, this is amazing. This book's literally changed your life, hasn't it? Rory, I also saw you nodding along to it, because we should bear in mind, apart from all of us here, people haven't read the English translation of the book yet. So maybe we should say a few words about it, possibly. Actually, Rory, do you want to summarize the book? What is it for you?
Sure, I can have a go at it. Irina would probably do a much better job, but
Well, maybe we can
I
contrast both summaries and see what you.
um yeah, I mean, for me, this is just a beautiful novel about a small Nenets community that is both an incredible immersion in the way of life of the indigenous Nenets people, particularly for those who are unfamiliar with the context, like I was when I came to read this book, as well as just a wonderful story about desire, love, community, tradition, and modernity, and learning how to live with what's around you and how to adapt yourself, or when not to adapt yourself, and when to. Also about aging and grief. I mean, there's just a huge amount of human emotion and drama in the book that I think are incredibly universal. And it's a wonderful piece of writing and a wonderful translation. There's a voice in this book that Irina has rendered that speaks directly to you as a reader from the first page. A voice that is often can be quite sort of extremely wise, a tiny bit scary, but in its focus on ethics, and also generous. And yeah, it's just very beautiful. That to me is what.
It's very appealing. I would agree with your analysis as well of like the voice that speaks to you and is like a bit otherworldly, but also just really rooted in tradition is kind of what I'm gathering from it as well. Um, I mean, it's also interesting as like you haven't said really anything about the plot and that kind of thing because it feels like that's not really. I mean, things happen in the book. It's about Alyoshka, who's the main character at the start anyway, being a young Nenets man who's deeply in love with somebody who's left their settlement, but still has to now get married because that is the way of his people. That's the way of life. But really, his refusal to really, he marries, but he doesn't accept the bride in the same way as like tradition has been done. And that really upsets the entire community. Is part of the plot, I guess. But yeah, I feel like that's an interesting kind of like a longer term view of community and life and so on and so on. Just now you've had three different summaries. You all have never seen. I'll read the book. I just wanted to know, I mean, we've not had Oliver's summary about this either. So I was wondering, maybe we can like have your summary about it in like, you probably first, I would assume, you first came across the book when Irina applied for a mentorship. Is that correct? Or did you know
No.
about it before? No.
No.
Oh, tell us.
So, no, I mean, this is what's quite extraordinary about the project. Coincidence that and this wasn't a very characteristic thing for me to do, but in 2000, the autumn of the year 2000, when I was still living in Russia, or I just come back for the summer, some friends in Moscow suggested that I join a cameraman and a theatre playwright on a trip to the Arctic Circle, to where Anna Nerkagi lives, and in Yamal, the peninsula that goes up in northwestern Siberia, where this is set. And the first thing I did when we got there was, she was the only author I knew about there, and went and met her. So I met her, and she put us up. She gave us steaming plates of reindeer meat when we got there. Actually, the first time I met her, and this is where I was nodding, Rory, when you said there's something scary, whether scary is the right word, but intimidating. She said, so I arranged a meeting with her. We met in the town of Salehard, I think. And she said, right, you've got half an hour. I want to know the degree of your curiosity. And this is the beginning. And I must have done a good enough job of persuading her of the degree of my curiosity, because she then invited us to the what should we call it, Irina, Laborovaya, the kind of because Anna Nerkagi is somebody who was brought up away from, in boarding school, from what I recall, Irina. This is what she writes about, the Soviet experience of Nenets families being broken up, children being taken away to boarding school, therefore traditions of Nenets life being interrupted. She started off as a writer, from what I remember, after studying, and then later in life, and this is roughly the time that I went out there, had decided, in what seems to me quite like a Tolstoy-like pattern, sort of moving back away from literature, back towards reality, towards deeds, towards self-sufficiency, sort of turned away from literature and set up this kind of village to teach Nenets children, especially, and orphans among them, and orphanhood is a big theme of White Moss, the skills they need to survive on the tundra, to continue the Nenets traditions of sledging with the reindeer, of making the tent, etc., and of cooking. And that's what I saw when I was there, this incredibly industrious, very impressive setup of a school, in other words. Yeah, sorry, I'm not quite sure how I got there, but that was how I first, and that's when I first read her. And then I came back, and I even wrote an article about going there and meeting her, which one can look up. It's quoted on the back of the book. And since then felt sad that connection that I'd sort of made with her hadn't borne any sort of other fruit. And so I was so delighted to see that I could mentor a translation of a book of hers. Not a book that I knew, because I knew some of her earlier work, which was sort of darker, more allegorical. This has a kind of purity to it, and especially in Irina's really remarkable translation, and a poetry to it that's very, very memorable.
Amazing, very exciting. Just to talk about the mentorship as well, and kind of also, I obviously coordinate the mentorship program at the National Centre for Writing, so I'm just trying to whether we can like piece together what part the mentorship played in the translation of this text. So just for anybody who doesn't know, the mentorship program at the National Centre for Writing is a 6-month program that pairs an emerging translator with a more established literary translator in their field, which generally is the language, but we also do non-language specific mentorships as well. So over the 6 months, mentor and mentee work together to hone the skills of the mentee. So it's not the focus isn't necessarily on one particular translation project and taking that from mentorship to publication, because for quite a lot of mentees, that's not how it works. So this makes this even more remarkable that there is this kind of arc. But the focus is on honing the skills of the mentee to kind of get them ready to embark on a Korean literature translation, which can be like learning about publishing, learning how to make contracts, all these kind of practical things as well. But also the mentor and mentee work is quite often focusing on like the sort of textual practice. How do you translate something? How do you translate tone? How do you translate voice? And different mentees bring different kind of questions to the mentorship. So, Irina, my question to you is like, what made you apply to a mentorship? What was it about the text that you're like, actually, I think this would make a good mentorship project? Or like, do you want somebody else's view on it? What were you working on during the mentorship as well?
Yeah, I think I'm a good example because in my case, the motivation was complete cluelessness about how anything works. But I really, really loved this book. And I just wanted to give it the best chance that it could get. And I knew that, the previous leg of my career did not prepare me to understand the publishing world, and in particular, the publishing world in the UK. Translation, as a multilingual person, I grew up bilingual and then I also did comparative literature as one of my degrees. I am used to the idea of translation and I've produced serviceable translations for various purposes, but I've never worked so precisely and so in depth and with such patience on anything really in my life, I don't think. And I would not be able to learn how to do it if it weren't for Oliver, who was just incredibly generous and kind and patient with all my questions and just infinitely, infinitely patient in commenting on my translations. And he's really modeled for me what it is like to love a text enough to pay so much attention to every single word and the word order and just returning again and again to the same passages to make sure that they shine through without any sort of, interruptions or these like moments when the reader is taken out of the text because something's not quite singing right. Yeah. So I guess I've talked a lot about the technical side, but of course I also learned enough about how publishing works to, I guess, pitch it. Um, and yeah, and all of that is because of the mentorship. I mean, the conversations we've had, the relationships I formed with other mentees and other mentors even is just, yeah, it was an amazing education for me.
Amazing. Oliver, what was the experience like for you?
Well, I mean, first of all, thank you, Irina, for everything you just said. I mean, it feels without false modesty, I don't feel like I had that as big a role as you say, because when it first came to me, it was already in a very polished, and I could, it wasn't a question of working out some sort of general strategy or starting from scratch. It was already a very expertly and beautifully established tone that you had, and that I think it was recognized at the time because you immediately won a prize, I think, for the sample that you translated. But nevertheless, it was also a wonderful experience for me to work with you on it. It took me back, so just very briefly, to my own experience of being mentored, which was in a sort of unofficial capacity, again, going back to when I was living in Moscow. And I had this stroke of fortune that the editor-in-chief of the newspaper I was working at in Moscow, who's called Sergei Roy, was bilingual and himself a translator. And he sort of took me under his wing, and email was present already then. We were able to sort of, he would just comment in depth on every we were working on short stories, every short story that I would submit to him. And in that case, in that instance, a lot of the mentorship was about the fact that my Russian at that stage was not really quite at the level, especially when it came to colloquial Russian, that it needed to be able to be confidently. So I absolutely needed that mentorship in an unofficial capacity in terms of my linguistic expertise. With Irina, it was very different because obviously her Russians are better than mine. But I suppose I brought the same kind of approach to it in a way that I'd learned from Sergei, which was the micro level. And I understand that mentorships can be done in very different ways. A mentor might take a very much more distanced approach to the text and focus more on the whole trajectory of a translator in terms of how they position themselves, what they need to do to support their translations outside the actual work on the text, and that's absolutely invaluable. But for myself, given my background, given my work as a teacher as well, I'm more inclined to go into the kind of detailed work that Irina mentioned, and that was a real joy to be able to keep returning to the same problems until we felt that we'd found a solution that wouldn't work just for one sentence, but for the book as a whole, because this book does throw up many such questions that needed to be fretted. What does one do? I mean, the most obvious example, Irina, that I can remember is many conversations we had about what to do about the word for tent, right? A very distinct and evocative word in Nenets culture and of the chum. And the unfortunate fact that if you just transliterated that into English, you'd get chum. And people would, apart from anything else, read that in an entirely, it would be entirely ambiguous on first reading. And I think that the balance that Irina ended up striking of retaining some very specific words to do with dress, to do with items of clothing, and with a very short glossary, done in a very understated way at the back of the book for about maybe 10 words, I think, works beautifully. But then in other cases, just to sort of match the tone and the wisdom of the book by aiming for simple language. So the tent, the flap of the tent, for the entrance of the tent, you ended up after our discussions going for those solutions that I think were totally persuasive and worked. So yeah, we worked together at that level of sort of meticulous analysis and returning, as Irina said, to the same passage again and again. So actually, we didn't get all that far through the novel, if we call it a novel, or I think it's a novel. But I suppose that what we talked about must have helped to lay the groundwork for the rest of your work on the book.
Absolutely.
That's a really interesting word. I'm a translator myself as well, and I always refer to this. I've got like a picture dictionary as well, because you like so many situations where you need these practical things. But what you're explaining there is like where the actual translation work starts, because I can look up a tent in the picture dictionary and have all the technical terms for that tent, and yet none of the technical terms might be apt in your situation, because you're like, yeah, for example, it might be a tomb and that's the apt thing, but actually it's somebody then reading it will misunderstand it. So like, although sometimes it's like the correct term, but it won't land in the right way, or sometimes it just doesn't have the right feeling. And so it's really interesting that what you're saying of like how the actual translation work starts when you try to like feel it and feel for the text as well and the texture of it and what works with it.
I was thinking of another example because I slightly worried that I made it sound almost too easy the way that you didn't do, which is in many ways the solutions that you found were very very brave ones. I mean, so there's been a general trend, I think, over decades. I mean, Rory, you'll probably back me up on this, or maybe you won't, but towards decapitalization in general, right? That loftier spheres of our existence tend to be decapitalized now. And Irina, for example, one of the big dichotomies, or one of the big sort of themes in Nenets culture is to do with speech and silence plays a very prominent role in human communication, it seems, in Nenets culture. It certainly did when I met Anna Nerkagi. There was a lot of silence. And by contrast, when there is speech, when there is, as you put it, the word, and as she puts it in the Russian, when somebody says a word to the fire, gives a speech to the fire, looks to the fire for wisdom, that word is carrying an enormous amount of weight. And your decision to capitalize that, it may seem like a small thing, but I think punctuation is super important in translation, in writing in general. What decisions we take, the way it visually looks, your decision to capitalize that throughout the book works brilliantly. And it's quite brave and sort of countercultural in some ways to do that, I think. But it's necessary. Yeah.
I think this might be a nice point to bring in Rory some more as well. just in terms of the practicalities first of like how you came across the book, I mentioned pitching, and then we can maybe then go into more detail about like, were you involved in the decision of capitalizing words, for example? You must have been. So yeah, so another way, did you decide to pitch to Pushkin Press? Was that your obvious choice? Did you produce multiple pitches? Rory, if you weren't the first person to be pitched to, just try and ignore that. If that comes out now.
Yeah, he pitched for years.
The last,
Years and years.
the last choice.
Well, definitely not the last choice. Definitely mentioned immediately because there's an obvious alignment in Pushkin's interest in, I guess, like offbeat, interesting things from other languages. But like I said before, I entered this project with a lot of enthusiasm and any sort of know-how I just kind of acquired along the way. So yeah, we pitched quite a lot, and the political landscape changed a little bit during our mentorship, which is why I also spent quite a long time sort of withdrawing into the book and just translating, because I had that thing to hold on to. I had this really, really wise text about people who persist in difficult situations they cannot control. And I guess at some point I just felt a little bit more, found a little bit more strength and went out into the world with the book again. And then, it was interesting enough to Rory.
So Rory, how did the pitch land with you? What was in your inbox, or maybe it was a verbal pitch? How did this happen?
It was an email. I looked it up before this conversation to remind myself. Irina emailed me with a bit about the book, and I think immediately with a sample translation and a bit about, I think you had already won that prize for the sample that you had translated. And I had actually already heard of Anna Nerkagi, so it was quite fortuitous in a way, because one of the things that publishers do when they're doing acquisitions or just in general is speak to each other internationally. So book fairs and whatever will always meet with editors from around the world and talk about their lists. And one list that I keep an eye on, because I just think it's really great and has a lot of overlap with our own, is Utopia Editore in Italy. And they have published Italian translations of 2 books by Anna Nerkagi. And so I felt immediately, I knew it was something that might work externally anyway. So I was kind of primed already. I was interested also immediately just by the subject and the writer. And the pitch was very good. But so it intrigued me. And I think from the get-go, when I opened it, I could see, here's style and voice, and, here's something. Immediately, the translation is obviously of a very high quality. So that's, you can often tell quite quickly, or at least I can, if it's definitely something to consider seriously and talk to colleagues about, and that was immediately clear. And from there, I think the team here was all very open to it and really interested in the project. And it was a really interesting dialogue with Pushkin's list, really, because we translate and publish a lot of predominantly classic literature from Russian. And this was something that felt like it had certain things in common with some of those things, and then certain things that are utterly its own and utterly unique to its writer and its context. And so we took it from there, really. And it was, a very nice process.
I was gonna say, would you mind saying a few words about, you mentioned you took it to the team as well. So like when a pitch lands in your inbox, it's what happens with it? You read it and you're taken by it, but that's not when you respond saying, yes, great, we'll publish this, presumably.
Yeah, I don't have full full power in that regard, no. So usually what will happen is someone on the editorial team will receive a pitch, or sometimes the pitch will come into our general inbox. And sometimes there's a bit of internal filtration. So if it's a crime novel, I'll pass it over to my colleague who handles our crime list. Or it's a little bit less in a genre space, but it just feels like a book that I know my colleague would like, or it feels more like their thing than mine. We just have this kind of general sense. We sort of share things around with each other and try to land pitches where they're most likely to be received, really. From there, the editor, in this case me, reads it if they can. The reading loads just get higher and higher, and it's really hard to know what to choose, what to prioritize, and you always feel torn in 100 directions. But how you know, or how I know, is when you're like, oh, okay, I'm being tugged like a reindeer is tugging me in this direction, and I have to follow. And I did really feel like that with this, because there was nothing else like it in my inbox. And so
So it made it
then
to the top of the to be read pile, basically.
it really
Great.
did. And so I then was like, well, I'm going to take it to the acquisitions meeting, which we have every few weeks, and every publisher has a version of this. And we sit around a table and we have minutes and we say, oh, this is what I'm reading. I think it's really good for these reasons. Other people feed in. You've shared it in advance sometimes, hoping that other people will have the time to read some of it as well, or you'll share it afterwards. And then we just talk about it. And that's when things go from, my personal response is just like, oh, I love this, to like, okay, can I persuade the room in a way? Or can I, it's the first test of, can this kind of go from inbox to book, or am I the person that can take this from inbox to book? Can I speak about it in a way that makes it sound like a book that makes sense in a bookshop, that we can imagine a readership for, that has a place either on our list or in general in the UK book world. And yeah, with this, it lined up. It made sense. Everybody was kind of eager to read it and intrigued, and the reads went from there.
Amazing. And just like roughly about the timeline of this, like obviously it depends on how quickly you get to revealing this, but like when did Irina get the good news? Like how many weeks? Because I think translators often pitch and we're like, I've not heard back, but that's not necessarily a bad sign, right?
No, it really isn't. I mean, I think this one, so much of it is down to chance, which is not really what anybody wants to hear. But it also means that you could, keep trying is a sort of really, that, like, I think in this case it was relatively quick, but that was unusual. I think it arrived at a time when I didn't have as much of a reading load as I do now. And I had already heard of Nerkagi, so it had it was a different case. But still, it always takes time, because the conversations in-house take time, and everybody else then has to read and all of that stuff. So it always takes time. Yeah, so I could never put a kind of date on it. I would always say that I am never sort of, like, a polite follow-up is never goes amiss. Not too frequently, but it generally, it's, things, inboxes are just hell. And well, things disappear and then you forget about them, and then sometimes something reminds you a few months later and you're like, oh, I really did mean to read that and I really do want to do it. But yeah, it's about striking the right editor at the right time. And
That's a really good point, and I think it's really helpful as well. I think it's really helpful for people to know as well that like what goes on behind the scenes of like why things are delayed. It's not that like people are like, oh, I'm so busy, I can't possibly like respond. It's not like you are obviously really trying to get through things, and as you say, like sometimes it's something you've been meaning to read and something else came wrong. But Oliver, you wanted to chime in as well.
Yeah, no, that was so interesting to listen to, and in a way, I was really pleased to hear what you said, Rory, because it sort of backs up what I've always tried to say to translators starting out, to be brave, to make that direct approach that Irina made, straight into your inbox, but obviously with a sample that's already at a very high level. I think people are often timid about taking that first step, but actually you've got absolutely nothing to lose in doing that. So yeah, what you just said, I think, demystifies the process in a way, in a very valuable way. But as a follow-up question, I wanted to ask, let's imagine that at the acquisitions meeting, for whatever reason, there wasn't space on the list. It just didn't seem possible to publish White Moss. What would you have said to Irina? Would there have been any advice? What would be the next stage for her, do you think, at that point?
I mean, again, it really varies. Usually, if I've taken something and I really have thought, oh, I would like to do this, and then other people have felt that it didn't make sense in the way that I thought it did, I would always get back and say, let them know, that we won't publish it, but that I really loved it. Because we could, that's not like a secret when, then the process shouldn't be a secret. It's not about like somebody here hated it. It's like, no, we have a list with a certain amount of space and a certain kind of mandate, and some editors vibe with the text and some don't, basically. And that falls out that way with all kinds of projects coming from agents or coming from translators, or, it's how the process works. But in that case, particularly because as part of the pitch, I knew that Irina I knew that she'd been in the mentorship, and I knew that this was a kind of, coming from an emerging translator sort of standpoint, I would always try and respond and say also, have you considered this publisher or that publisher? Because I can imagine many other publishers having published White Moss. And so, yeah, I say, I don't want to say that I would always do that in all cases, because one of the things I'm really wary of in these settings is kind of over promising or over compensating, because I feel so much the struggle and difficulty of trying to make it in translation. It's so difficult, and it must require so much persistence and sensitivity to rejection and difficulty. But at the same time, yes, I would always try and engage in that sense, and try to point someone in the direction that maybe would be more amenable, or at the very least say, I really, really like this. We're toning it down, but I really see potential here, and I'm sure that somebody else would as well.
And that's already really helpful advice, isn't it? Like, if you do have the time, and if it's a pitch that merits that, for the translator to know, okay, these are the sort of things, this are the sort of things that this editor is interested for their list. And maybe if I've got something else that is similar to that, they know they can, like, approach you with that as well. And that might be something that you're interested in, rather than you saying, like, that's something we absolutely don't publish because it doesn't fit with what we're going, is also helpful advice, isn't it? When, like, you get a pitch that just is like, no, that's not for Pushkin, for example. I think that's also part of the thing that I think emerging translators struggle with, is like, what makes this list. Like, we always talk about the list, but, like, I think every editor seems to also have their own preferences, and, like, kind of, it's something that's more of a sort of feel for a book, rather than, so yeah. But yes, it's really helpful too. So, in terms of you, Rory, and Irina working together, how did that take shape? I'm presuming Oliver wasn't really involved in that process anymore? No. So, Irina and Rory, how did you work?
Well, on my side, it was a dream. I sent off my drafts. Rory came back with very sensitive and sensible questions and comments, and we kind of worked through them. Also in a very sort of detailed, nuanced way, which made me feel very happy, and that the book was in safe hands. That's how I would describe it.
It's really nice to hear. It was a really lovely process for me as well. I mean, once we'd acquired the book and commissioned the translation, it was a case of waiting for delivery, and it delivered in a beautiful state. And then, approaching the edit, it was complicated just because the book is so particular. I mean, Irina had made all of these really brilliant decisions about how to render this in English, and how to be sensitive to how certain things are understood in its culture, that in a way that is different from Anglophone cultures. So, like Oliver was saying about the word and silence, and that comes across so well in the translation, the relationship to fire, and just small linguistic touches that were pronounced as specific to the culture, but that were also really clear to an English reader. And so some of my questions were about those. A lot of the time, I mean, I'm sort of in these settings, I feel a little bit, some of the questions I always feel like are slightly reductive, but it's not about we must change this. It's more like, okay, this is the decision, right? Or, asking for clarification. And then sometimes it's about individual lines being like, okay, this feels like it needs another look. It doesn't, I think you said, Irina, it doesn't quite sing yet. And that was particularly in a book that is full of really beautiful lines. So sometimes we were like, okay, let's give it one more go, or let's rearrange the syntax very slightly. And I do think there are a few cases where there were some really tricky lines that I think we got into great shape. But we sat with them for a while. We tried 2 or 3 different things and had some back and forth, and that's the kind of thing I really love to do in editing is, okay, let's try it this way, or have we got that way? Or there's some really unusual images, and then, I'd say, oh, this is a bit confusing, and Irina would say, yeah, it's confusing in the Russian text as well. I don't know what the hell is it? No, we obviously knew what it was. But it's always fascinating for me to go to that and be like, oh, okay, so this is what we have, and this actually does make sense.
What is your response when the translator says, "Oh, but it's confusing in the original as well"? Do you
I say,
do you look
make
up
it
on
work. No, I think because usually it's not. They don't just say it's confusing in the original as well. Leave me alone. Usually it's then, and here is how and why, and then sometimes it really depends. Sometimes I'm like, yeah, I see that this is actually the most sensible way to do that, or I say, okay, I see this, but however, maybe can we do something a bit more like that? And yeah, it's always a suggestion, and I find a lot of the time I feel like some of the use of an editor that doesn't have the language at all is to like make a bad suggestion, but that steers you onto one that's better. Like, I don't really have ego in that sense of like needing to write in and have to have my comment be the one that's taken, but it's more like, okay, here's something that's come to my mind without any of the text. And then sometimes it will like open a way towards a pathway for somewhere that the translator can actually refine into something that really works for the text and the translation.
That's really valuable as well. I kind of think like in the mentorship, like it's we have around sort of between 8 and 10 mentorships each year, and they all work in different language combinations. But part of the benefit of that is, and you mentioned this as well, is you have a cohort of translators at your level. Everybody's working into English, but like some might understand the source text, others don't. But that's actually they're really good um kind of group of people to keep you in check as well, because you can read the translation to them and say like, what do you think? And they might, yeah, say what you say, like kind of be a sort of first editor, or like, I don't have this language, but this sounds a bit weird. Is it meant to sound weird? And you kind of get this kind of feedback from somebody who is aware of what is involved in translation. And Rory, I really appreciate that you talk about this as well, because I think sometimes we hear some horror stories of like, editors having no idea what translation is, and then just like going through with a red pen, we're like, this doesn't make sense, this sounds weird, this is not English, like that kind of thing. But you obviously
I would never speak ill of another publisher, but no, but it's it's true. It's a really specific kind of editing, and not everybody across the publishing world will be sensitive to that. And I think a lot of editors who work predominantly with the English language, where they can kind of cut a paragraph here or reshape this or whatever, can find it a little bit more difficult. Whereas I'm sort of the opposite. I've worked always with translation. That's how I started out, and so it's actually the other way for me that's more difficult. I'm like, but you wouldn't move the paragraph, but obviously in English, actually, maybe you would. But the edit was fascinating for other reasons too. Oliver's already mentioned the glossary, which we decided made sense, and I think maybe some editors would have been like, no, we can't have these terms all through the text, but obviously they have to be there. And I think Irina was very careful and considered about which things to keep and which things to render, and there was no sense that anything was being kept that didn't need to be kept, and it gives so much to the translation to have these stay, and to not, particularly when we're working with a text that comes from an Indigenous community that is sort of marginalized within its broader national context. The idea of trying to cut that or make it any less itself would be uncomfortable, but that never was part of the discussion.
I just wanted to build on what you were saying, Rebecca, about the mentorship. And reflecting now on this project, it really was a communal project. And maybe that should be one of the biggest pieces of advice that I can give to emerging translators, is that it takes a village. And in my case, for the glossary, for example, I've had a lot of conversations with Nenets friends where I've pestered them again, but are you sure it's this? But what about this? And I looked through all of these, you know, museum websites, all of these databases describing different objects. And yeah, and then after, obviously, during the mentorship, I had this wonderful community and we were all in touch. And then afterwards, I found some translators in Sheffield and we had a little working group and we were often just doing work dates and even workshop different parts of the text together. And I also, by the end of it, just kind of um, got all of my friends to help me with the novel. And I kept asking everyone, does this work? So whether or not they spoke any languages involved doesn't really matter. I just need to know, like, I guess I was, yeah, it's again this, the love that I have for this project is just, I just really wanted to make sure that it will be as perfect as it can be for the readers. So, yeah, I guess I just want to bring that up and make that visible. Lots and lots of people contributed to making this happen in big ways and small ways. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's such a an appropriate way as well as to for this particular book, which is all about community, isn't it? To draw attention to the community that is behind it as well. And I think this is partly what we're trying to say here as well. Is you might be in the bookshop picking up this book, but actually thinking about the process of and this is why I wanted to draw attention. Well, I've got this one here as well. This is where the sample was for the 2022 publication. You can find it on the National Centre for Writing website as well. So you'll see, if you're interested in the sort of process that text has gone through, you might find there's no changes from the sample to the actual book, but that there's a lot of people involved in publishing a book, in producing a translation as well, and so many people who bring so much care to it as well, which is fascinating. You're also already drawing on, you kind of giving a bit of advice on for emerging translators and what we might find useful for them as well. So I was wondering, with that, both sort of practical advice for emerging translators starting out in general, but also if we can maybe draw a bit on as translators and the publishing world is also often at the sort of whim of political events and so on as well. And you're saying obviously for Russia, that is a difficult landscape at times, and it took longer to pitch it because of politics going on around us. So I was just wondering, both as translators who rely on the work as well, and also as publishers, how do you weather these kind of political events in your publishing endeavors? I don't know if Rory wants to go first. Well,
Sure. As publishers, we're always very much responding to what's happening in the world, and also as individuals as well, of course. And so, yeah, it does change what you imagine as a sort of readership for a book, if world events are sort of having an impact in that way, or the kinds of things that you want to publish or dedicate your time to as well. And then in the case specifically of Russia, I mean, translation funding is no longer available. We're not working with institutes there that used to fund translation, and so that changes the kind of economics of doing any kind of work like that. I think in this case, when this project came to me, it felt so specific to the Nenets community and culture. And what was so interesting to me about this is the kind of way that it is really sort of expanding what it is to be a Russophone writer, a writer from Russian, from a community that has a very different relationship to a kind of centralized Russophone culture. And so in that sense, as a publishing a work of writing from an indigenous community from Russia, it felt really compelling and important and interesting to me.
It's a really good point as well for translators to know that a lot of published translations rely on funding from cultural institutions as well to kind of make the bottom line work, right? So it's not just sometimes if people get rejections, it might just also simply be that it costs more to do a translation because you have to pay for the translation in addition to the rights for the author and so on as well. So I think that's a really good point to highlight as well. I out of Oliver and Irina, if you want to also give advice for translators and how do you make it work?
I think my advice would be really existential as opposed to business savvy. And you know what? It's worked for me. Yeah, I mean, this world is very difficult to live in. And what's worked for me is just, I guess, really letting it sink in that the world doesn't owe me anything. It does not owe me a publishing contract. It does not owe me attention. It does not owe me approval. And that's okay. Like, it's not about me having kind of an amazing career as a translator. It is much more for me about care and just handling things with care, you know. I can't really affect big events in the world, but I can affect how the people and stories that come into my life, how my life helps them a little bit. And I think for that reason, my advice would be to focus on what matters and focus on stories or projects that you really feel enhanced life and, could make a difference to someone. And I'm not talking about the sort of like publishing or, greater cultural industry, make a difference sort of branding, but really truly that could bring someone solace and strength and a little bit of wisdom, which is what we all could use. So how did all of this work out? I don't know. I just kept, you know, step by step, one foot in front of the other, just holding on to that love and care. And and I think this project attracted people who saw that in the book. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think,
Oliver.
Rebecca, it's such a complicated question about how one weathers, these major transformative international upheavals that we've been seeing, the war and other events in recent years. Of course, this mentorship also happened in the aftermath of COVID, which was also,
Well,
changed things in different ways, changed how we work together. But in terms of, I think the cultural repercussions of the war have been extremely complex and very multifaceted and very difficult to summarize. One extreme, in terms of me, how I've weathered it as a translator who's also a teacher. I happen to have translated one of the big Russian classics, right? Crime and Punishment. It so happens that during COVID, I don't know, Dostoevsky's short novella White Nights became a sort of TikTok sensation or whatever. And so, that's a random event that then spilled over on what were already healthy sales of his novels. And, that helps you weather something. So another repercussion, a very, very welcome, very overdue one, is this expansion of our knowledge in English now of Russophone writing, outside sort of central Russia, the Russian cities. So we now have not just Anna Nerkagi, but we've got Yuri Ridhel, the Chukchi writer. We've got, the Uzbek author Hamid Ismailov doesn't need any introduction now. The Armenian Narine Abgaryan. These are just some names that have really made a big impression in English in the last few years, and I think that's marvelous. And these are all four of those are wonderful authors. There's Chingiz Aitmatov, who's long overdue a recovery in English. One could go on. At other levels, the repercussions are very difficult on an individual level, right? Because there's an enormous amount of internal pressure in our own countries, in social media. There's a great deal of what people are calling for ethical clarity, for example. That's sort of become a buzzword. We don't really know what we mean by it a lot of the time, especially when we relate it to literature, which is something that tends to deal in ambivalence, multivalence, in complicated questions that aren't really reducible to op-ed pieces in newspapers, to issues of right and wrong, often in many cases. And so I suppose my advice is really what Irina has illustrated, that you're going to be worried about, in a very fraught atmosphere, you're going to be worried about how this book is going to play out, right? Are people going to see it as this or as that, as pro this or anti that? And I think at that point, you really have to hang on to that motivation, Irina's talking about holding on to, that made you want to, above and beyond whatever's happening in the world, what made you want to transfer that book into English in the first place. And you may need to sort of hunker down for a bit and wait for some things to, some of that pressure to pass a little bit. But yeah,
Yes.
I would say that that persistence that you mentioned, that is also a theme of this book, is very important.
Mm.
Yeah, there's much more that one could say, but in
I
terms
know,
of
I know. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, did you want to add something?
No, it's fine.
I know it's too much to say. I feel like we also need to come to a close, unfortunately, because we've already been speaking about this for an hour. But what's kind of coming out for me from this as well is like how much chance and serendipity play as much a part in these book projects as sheer passion. But I think it's the passion that keeps driving. I mean, we talk about passion projects for a reason. I think that's sometimes the thing when you talk about mentorship. Like, do you focus on like something really passionate about, or do you like do the sort of practical, like, here's what I should be doing, stepping stones, but in order to get a career? And both of these have got positives to them. Both of them might work out, but also it's really good to hear that like sometimes it is the passion that drives you forward. It's the serendipity that then like propels it to the next level. And it's just so heartening to have this book here that like started off life like 5, 6, 7 years ago. Like in translation, the book itself we said is older, but obviously the stories go way back. Rory had heard about Anna Nerkagi already. Oliver happened to have been to see her even years before then. Who could quantify any of this in a book? And yet we are lucky enough that we have got book for
Yeah.
this now.
If I could just come back in on that, and I totally agree. There's enthusiasm, and then there's passion, and there's serendipity, which I think in some ways is kind of related to that enthusiasm. But enthusiasm makes serendipitous things happen in many cases. But there's also the responsibility, right? And I think that's come through. So we've talked quite a lot about the micro level of choices and things. But when you're, as Irina is doing, taking an author under your wing and bringing it into another language, you're not just responsible for those small choices. You're responsible for the whole phenomenon, the whole book, the author's afterlife in English. And I suppose, in terms of what an emerging translator should think about, it seems to me it's not just about, I love this book, I want to translate it. It's not just how I'm going to translate it, but it's also in taking this on, I'm not necessarily advocating for it. I don't think one has to justify the author one is translating, but taking on that immense responsibility. I don't know how else to put it. That comes with that. That probably sounds very grand. I'm not sure, but I just wanted to put something. There's a different dynamic that's come out of what Irina's was talking about. That maybe I haven't found the right words for, but hopefully, Rory, it looked like you were nodding. You understand what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's something that you think about as a publisher as well, and in assessing anything like this too, is translation and making sure that it's as good as it can be, but also in trying to make sure that you're not trying to reduce or squash a book that comes from a particular context into something that might fit a UK bookshop and things like that. I mean, it does sound heavy to talk about it as responsibility, but I really think that is true. And always trying to work in collaboration with the people that brought the project to, for instance, in this case, Irina, to make sure that things are being done in the right way. I mean, I could easily butcher something to do with Nenets culture because I'm not so familiar with it in a cover copy, and then have her correct me and things like that. So I think, it extends right the way from individual word choices of the translation to how the book looks, to how we talk about it, to people. It's it is
and also your responsibility to the author as well, right? And that's often a very complicated one when the author's alive or when the author is dead. And that's another aspect of this.
Irina, did you want to say something to that as well?
Some final words? Yeah, I guess I could bring it back to the thing that I said in the beginning, which is that I found this book at an interesting time in my life of disappointment and frustration and this sort of refusal to explain anything to people about, minority cultures. But I think that, I mean, being born into this world, we are responsible. There's no getting away from it. And for me, this was perhaps a way of seeing what it would look like to step into that role of responsibility for myself and others. Part of the reason why I was so frustrated with this idea of becoming an Indigenous explainer, which is a career that is available to you in academia and I suppose in other content creation industries, is that I've seen just so much of it done badly because I come from a hyper-specific culture. The language that we speak is not Indo-European. That's already the
Right.
beginning. Like as soon as you start translating things become lost. And watching others describe me to me has been frustrating, hilarious, tedious, entertaining, but not really fulfilling very much. So I hope that experience has kind of sensitized me to taking care of this project, you know? And yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful novel that is just crystal clear and very wise and harsh and also very tender. And I feel like we're all we're holding it like this and we're offering it to the world. And I hope there'll be people who will realize what an amazing gift this is.
Thank you so much. What a beautiful summary. This has been such a delightful discussion, and I wish we could go on forever. Maybe we'll do a follow-up event about the content of the book and capitalization and care and responsibility. And we touched on so many things, but I hope that's given the audience a bit of an overview of how a book like this can come about and the long journey it's gone through and the many people have handled it with such care. Thank you so much for being really caring and responsible and thoughtful interlocutors as well. Thank you, Rory. Thank you, Oliver. Thank you, Irina. Goodbye.